Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final session of Samson the Nazarite, Soul on Fire, with Rabbi David Silber, part of our summer 2026 Kolo. In this series, we have been investigating the celebrated character and tale of Samson from the Book of Judges, paying special attention to his status as a Nazarite, exploring the implications and significance of such status. It's been a pleasure learning these past couple of weeks with Rabbi Silber, the founder and dean of Drisha. Sources for today will come from chapters 15 and 16 of Shoftim. While we will share sources on screen when Rabbi Silber is quoting, I also strongly recommend keeping a Tanakh at hand. If you have your own preferred translation, keep it, refer to it. And with that, let's get started.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to wrap up today. Obviously, there's always more to say about Shimshon, but there are some additional features of the story we haven't discussed yet. So what happened previously was that Shimshon went to Timnah, finds a woman he wants to marry. There's a wedding party. And before the wedding party, he tells a riddle. The riddle was a function of his own experience. He had been confronted by a lion. He kills the lion. He comes back next time, and he sees inside the lion is a beehive. He takes the honey, and when he comes to the party, this wedding party, he poses a riddle to the guests, so-called friends of the bride or the bride's family. From the one who ate is eaten, and from the powerful came out sweetness. And he says to them, if you can't figure out the riddle, each of you should give me a tunic, a coat. If you can figure out the riddle, I'll give each of you a coat and a tunic. There are 30 guests at the wedding, and they can't figure it out, so they pressure the bride to tell them the key to the riddle. Find out from Shimshon, your husband, what the riddle means, and then otherwise, when you brought us here to impoverish us, they threaten her. So she begins to try to get him to tell her the riddle, the solution. He initially refuses. However, she keeps pressuring him, and he tells her the riddle, the solution of the riddle. On the last day of the wedding party, they solve the problem. Shimshon understands they had pressured his wife. He goes out. He owes him 30 coats. He goes out and he slays 30 Philistines in the city of Ashkelon, is one of the 5 Philistine cities, and he brings them their coats, and he storms off in anger. That's what we have so far. Meanwhile, the last verse of chapter 14, Vatiyesh et Shimshon, the Mire'eu asher re'ah lo. So after he walks out, the father gives her to one of the wedding companions. So she's now married to one of the wedding companions. Okay, he walked out, and out of anger, and so now she's married to somebody else. Now we get to chapter 15. It says, "Vahi miyamim b'mektzir chitim, vayifkod Shimshon et ishto b'gdizim, vayoma avoa el ishti achadra, v'lo nitano avia lavo." So Shimshon, after he decides to return, he comes back with a gift for his wife. As far as he's concerned, she's still his wife. It's not clear that he knows that she's been given to somebody else. That's unclear. It's actually an interesting case. It's exactly the case the Torah talks about. I had discussed recently in a different class about someone who was married, divorces, and then she marries somebody else, and then he wants to take her back. The Torah actually forbids that. So it's an interesting case. Now over here, it's not clear he actually divorces her. I don't want to get into that, but it's an interesting parallel to the case of the Torah. In any event, he returns back, comes with a gift, and he says to the father-in-law, I want to go to my wife. However, the father-in-law does not, her father does not permit him to reconnect to his wife. She's married to somebody else. Now, chapter 15, the second pasuk, Vayomer Aviyah, Omar Amarti, Ki Sanos Neita, Vietnada Lemreyacha, Halo Achota Aktana Tava Mimena, Tina lecha tachtel. So the father says, listen, I thought you hated her. A reasonable assumption, because he understands that they have used her. On the other hand, she betrayed him. So the father says, listen, I gave her to somebody else. I thought you hated her. But if you want, I have another daughter. I have a younger daughter who's better than her. Achota haktana tova mimena, a better daughter. Tina lecha tachtel. You can take her instead. You can take that wife instead. Shimshon said to them, I guess the father of the family, Dikiti hapam mipushtim. That I've had enough with you Philistines, he says. Ki ose ani ibam ra'ah. I'm going to harm you. So once again, he's using this scene with the wife to attack the Philistines, because he generalizes from the father or the father's family, who has so-called betrayed him. I've had enough with you, he says. I'm gonna harm you. We're gonna harm the Philistines. Now, before we get to what Shimshon does to harm the Philistines, let me just point out what is obvious, but I'll say it in any event, that this idea, this scene, we have encountered before, actually. And actually, we've encountered it in two different places. This is in my book, by the way, this particular piece. But as I mentioned later on about the book, or get the book, about our learning together and what one of the great values is in this approach. I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But we have seen this before. And it's important always to think about other parallel texts. There are two glaring examples of we have very similar situation.
Shaul.
Shaul, that's the second one. We'll get to Shaul in the second one, of course. That's 100% right. And I'll get to Shaul. But even before you get to Shaul, let's start with the obvious case, right at the beginning of the Chumash. And that's the story of Yaakov.
Lavan.
Right?
Lavan.
Yaakov and Lavan. Lavan has two daughters. Lavan has the older daughter and the younger daughter. Yaakov loves the younger daughter in that case, right? Yaakov says to Lavan, Lavan says to Yaakov, I'm not getting into the whole story here, we'll be here for the whole hour, but Yaakov says to Lavan, Yaakov has run away from home to escape his brother, also to find a wife. And he's with him for a month. Yaakov says to Lavan, because you're my brother, my relative, you should work for nothing? Tell me, what are your wages? In other words, with Lavan, there's no evidence Yaakov's working at all. Yaakov went to his uncle. It's his uncle's house. To Lavan, there's no such thing. Lavan, it's all business, it's all commodities. What are your wages? So Yaakov says to Lavan, I'll work for you for 7 years. He offers to work for 7 years. By the way, just parenthetically, why does he offer to work for 7 years? 7 years is a very long time. His mother had said, you go away for a few days. I'll call you back in a few days later. Why does Yaakov volunteer for 7 years? Nothing to do with Shimshon, but just since we're learning, anybody have a thought? I have a thought, which is an important thought in the story. After I say it, you'll tell me it's obvious. Well, it is obvious, actually, but it's not obvious till I'll say it, which is this. The point of it is that Yaakov knows from the very beginning that what he's asking for is something inappropriate. He knows that. And that's why he says what he says. Rashi says he said, trust the guy. He may not trust him. But that's not why he says it. He knows that normally speaking, you don't marry the younger one before the older one. But Yaakov wants Dafka to marry the younger one. So he says, listen, I know this is not normal, but I'll work for you. But if you give me the younger one, I'll work for you for 7 years. Of course, after 7 years, Lavan, under the pretext, I think, of the people of the town won't permit it, but he already had agreed to it. What can I do? He says, I can't. You can marry her, but not right now. Another 7 years of work, etc. So there you have the story of the older and the younger. And there, it's Yaakov who is tricked by Lavan. Because Yaakov thought he had a deal. And he had a deal. But when you look at the Chumash, you realize that Lavan never actually agreed to what Yaakov said. Because when Yaakov says, I'll work 7 years for Rachel, the younger one, Lavan said, I'd rather give it to you than anybody else. That's what he said. No one else will marry you. That's all he says. which is true. No one else will marry her. The only small detail is 7 more years of work, which he manages to wheedle out of Yaakov. But the point is, in that story, we're told that Lavan says to Yaakov, you can't give the younger before the older. Can't the katana before the gedola. Of course, when you're studying the Chumash, you recognize immediately that's playing off the story of Yaakov and Esau, of the younger supplanting the older, not a problem. But there you have the story. You have the father-in-law, you have the son-in-law, you have the switch, and there you have the father-in-law is tricking the son-in-law. That's one story. Then we have another story, as someone mentioned before. That's the story of Shaul. David, after slaying Goliath, David kills Goliath, and he was told by the people at the battlefield, when Goliath emerges, mocking all of Israel, and challenging all of Israel, and David says, "What's going to be to the one who kills Goliath? What's going to happen to him?" And the people say to him, "Oh, if he kills Goliath, the king will treat his family with a lot of respect. Maybe he won't have to pay any taxes, and he'll give him his daughter for a wife." And then David goes out and he slays Goliath. So the king, at that point, King Saul wants to kill David because he's jealous of David, or he fears David, thinks David wants to take away his kingship. So he says, and we discussed this, I believe, I have a daughter, Meirav. You can marry my daughter on one condition, that you will be a ben chayil, you'll be a valiant soldier. You will fight the wars of God. And David, in that instance, as you recall, rejects the offer. There's a time limit on the offer, and David rejects it. Because David says to himself, clearly, the text doesn't tell us why he rejects it, but obviously David understands, and the text has told us what Saul is thinking. Saul says, why should I kill him myself? Let the Philistines kill him. And David, it would appear, figures this out, and David declines. I'm unworthy. Who am I to do it? I'm an impoverished, whatever. And the time elapses, and Saul marries her to somebody else. Right. Then we're told, Saul was told that the older daughter, named Michal, loves David. And Saul is very pleased with this. We discussed this. Vayishar b'einav, it suits his purposes. And he says to his sons, go tell David, king doesn't want money. King, kill me 100 Philistines. If you kill 100 Philistines, you can marry the other daughter, the younger one. And David accepts that. It's by Yishar b'einav, David accepts it. We noted last time the expression Vayishar b'einav. It was suitable. It was good in his eyes. Suited his purposes. And David goes out and kills Philistines. According to our text, he kills 200. And David becomes the son-in-law of the king. In that story over there, you again have the older and the younger. You have the father-in-law and the son-in-law. But in that story, unlike the story of Yaakov and Lavan, where Lavan able to trick Yaakov and to get what he wants, which is 7 more years of work. For Lavan, it doesn't matter which daughter it is. He uses the daughters, he uses everybody. But in the case of Shaul and David, there David does not fall for it. There David gets what he wants, which is to become the son-in-law of the king, and he's able to do it. We discussed last time why David accepts the second offer and not the first. And I suggested, I think it's the simple reading of the text, it's because the second offer is a finite offer. Kill me 100. In fact, he kills 200. The other one, be a warrior, there's no end. Fight the wars of God. The wars of God are never ending. Be a ben chayil, which means a valiant warrior. It means special operations, dangerous missions. Says David to himself, I may be very talented, but you slip up one time, and that's the end, right? Interesting, by the way, as an aside, that Hayeli ben chayil, be a valiant warrior. That's what Saul says to David. David declines. Saul tries to get David killed by the enemy. That's what Saul tries to do. This way, I don't. Why should I kill him myself? Let him die in war, and the enemy will kill him. But David sees through it. But there's a parallel story in the book of Shemuel where the king does exactly that. The king wants to get rid of somebody, someone who's a problem for him, but he doesn't want to kill him himself. He wants the enemy to kill him. And that time it actually works. The enemy does kill him. And what story is that? Obviously, that's the story of Uriah Hittite, David and Bathsheba. It's exactly what David does. He sends him into war, he gives instructions, and Uriah is killed. In that story, by the way, without getting into the details of it, we're told that Yoav, the general, puts him in a place, Asher Yoadah ki b'nei chayil sham. He puts him in a place where the valiant warriors are there, which means a dangerous place. He doesn't actually do what David tells him to do. That's not our province here. But my point is that Ben Chayil is a place of danger. In every war, there are more dangerous places and less dangerous places. So about a month ago, we had D-Day, celebrated January 6th, June 6th, D-Day. The Allied forces invade Europe and enter into France and Germany. But those are the first people who went in D-Day, the beaches of Normandy, many died. It was a very dangerous mission. It was a necessary mission, but it's very, very dangerous. So there are soldiers who have different roles in war. But anyway, in that case, for our purposes, there you again have the older and the younger. Now here, what's interesting is, I cite this as an example. There are many, many such examples. You have exactly a story which is playing off those two stories. In this case, the father-in-law says to him, I'll give you the younger one instead. The older one he gives away to somebody else. But the younger one, he says, I'll give you the younger one. In this case, the one, she's better than the older one. But in this case, Shimshon says, no, thank you. He storms off. I've had enough with you Philistines. I've had enough. And my point is that I think the book of Shoftim wants you to think of these other stories and the various responses. But the point that I was pushing for is that the story of Shimshon and his wife or potential wives and the father-in-law, etc., etc. All this suits his purposes, which is the purpose. He has a mission in life. He's been commissioned by God to kill the Philistines. The Jews don't want to kill the Philistines. The Jews are very accepting of the fact that the Philistines are the rulers. Moshulim banu plishtim in the chapter. The Philistines are the rulers. That may what the Jews may think. But God has a different point of view. And Shimshon has been commissioned by God to kill the Philistines, but he can't kill them as a Jew. This is the point I make. He's not killing them as a Jew. He can't fight directly for the Jews. He brings redemption to the Jews. Not that they want this redemption. He brings redemption. He can't fight as a Jew. He fights, the fights are, one might say, purely personal. That's what this story is about. It's going to be personal. So Shimshon storms off over here, and Vayelech Shimshon, Vayukod Shilosh Bayot Shualim, Vayikach Lapidim, Vayifen Zanav El Zanav, Vayosem Lapid Echad Ben Shnei Haznavot Batavech. What Shimshon does is he takes 300 foxes. Notice how the numbers have grown. In the first story, there were 30. It's about 30 coats. In this case over here, there are 300. We'll soon get to 3,000. So he is sort of escalating. He takes the foxes. Between each fox, he puts a torch. And he sends the foxes throughout the fields of the Philistines. I just want to make the point over here that you have over here, what Shimshon is doing in the story over here, 2 points. First of all, I said Shimshon fights alone. One of the unique features of the Shimshon story is he has no army. The natural army would be the Jewish people, but the Jewish people are not his interest, zero interest in fighting, and that's why God had to go outside the Jewish people and create this being who's Jew, not Jew. He's the Nazir. He's totally separate. That's number one. He has an army. The army are the foxes. The army is the natural order. But the army is not the people. He fights alone, but he has the natural order with him. That's number one. And number two, The second point I want to emphasize over here is the fire. His name is Shimshon, which is Shemesh. His name is the sun. The sun is, we say in our blessings every day, the sun is one of God's servants, actually. Right? The first blessing of the Shema, a very beautiful blessing of the Shema. These are God's servants. These are God's ministers. In the first blessing of Shema, it talks about the constellations, the stars, the sun, the moon. They are the servants of God. And within the first blessing of the Shema, we also include the Kedusha, which is a different set of servants of God. There's the reason that Kedusha is included in that first blessing, because there's a relationship between the servants of God, namely the heavenly spheres, who are the Mishartim of God, the servants of God. And within that blessing, we have included the Kedusha, the angels who call to each other in praise of God, the Mishartim, the Ofanim, the Chayot HaKodesh, etc. Amongst them are the Srafim, the seraphs, right? The flaming angels, I would say. Shimshon is a flaming angel, and he's the sun. The sun is a source of light, but it's also the source of heat. Anybody who's been in New York the last few days can attest to that, by the way. The sun is a source of heat. It's pretty impossible here. Anyway, so there's a theme of fire. And the theme of fire actually extends because let me just read a couple of verses. And then I'll stop for a minute, and I want to make a different point about this approach, which in 1 second, I'll get to that. So the Philistines respond in the next pasuk, Vayomru Plishtim, mi asazot? Vayomru Shimshon Chatan Atimni, ki lokachat ishto, vayitnoga mirayegu. Well, who did this? Oh, Samson, because of his father-in-law. There's the Philistines. Why is he so angry at us? Oh, because his father-in-law, took his wife and gave it to somebody else. Oh, here's the cause. Vayaro Plishtim, vayisrafu ota v'yetavio ba'esh. So the Philistines, responding to Shimshon, they burn up the father and the daughter. They're responding in kind. Shimshon burns their fields, and they believe that the reason for it is personal issue he has with the Philistines, which of course is the pretext, but not the real reason. In any event, they respond in similar fashion to Shimshon. And here we have. I just want to make two comments, and I'll take any comments or questions. One is, I know some of you are learning Gemara in the summer, and we're learning Perek HaChoveh. It's the 8th Perek, of course, of Bava Kama. Talks about what happens when you damage another person, when you injure another person. That's the subject of Perek HaChoveh. And the first sugya in HaChoveh deals with the question of the rabbinic understanding of what happens when you injure another person. The Torah says in multiple places that when you injure another person, ayin tachat ayin. Ayin tachat ayin, yod tachat yod, regel tachat regel. The Torah says explicitly, the plain reading of the Chumash, as an eye for an eye. What you give is what you get. And that idea that what you give is what you get, by the way, we actually encounter that even before you get to an eye for an eye, which the Gemara insists on interpreting to be money, monetary payment for the eye. But the plain reading of the Chumash would not appear to be so. The plain reading of the Chumash in more than one place, in several places, clearly is literally an eye for an eye. Okay, the rabbinic tradition doesn't accept that, or it doesn't accept it as a practical matter, at least. It's never carried out. I'm not going to get into that whole interesting question. But even before you get to an eye for an eye in Shemot and in Vayikra, etc., you have at the very beginning of the Torah when it talks about murder. Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by the human shall his blood be shed. And that verse not only has two parallels to it, whoever sheds the blood of the human, by a human shall the blood be shed, but it's actually a chiastic structure. It's A, B, C, C, B, A. The very structure of the verse suggests something which is typical of the Bible, which is Justice means equality. Whatever I did is what I'm going to get. And this idea of the idea of punishment being the most correct, most just punishment is what I did to you gets done to me. I would say that is maybe the default idea of punishment in the Bible. And you have this coming up in the Shimshon story. You have it both with the Philistines say this within the story. We want to get to, in the next story where they go to they get to go to the tribe of Judah, beginning in verse number 9, and the Judeans say in verse number 10 to the Philistines, "What are you starting up with us for? Like, we're good citizens, we don't bother anybody." No, it's not about you, they say. It's about Shimshon. It's about Shimshon, right? We want to do to Shimshon what he does to us, right? Whatever he, that's all. We want just justice from Shimshon. What he did to us, we want to do to him. And they go to Shimshon, and Shimshon says, "Are you going to kill me?" And they say to Shimshon, "We're not going to kill you. We're just tying you up. We're going to tie you up." And he says, and they say, "What are you making trouble for?" And Shimshon says, right? What they did to me, I'm going to do to them. Each side says exactly the same thing. Basically, ayin tachat ayin, which in the Shimshon story later actually appears as ayin tachat ayin. They actually blind him later. But my point is that's interesting. What that suggests is, for those studying Hachovel, well, for all of us, that the default punishment of the Bible, what makes the most sense, is actually ayin tachat ayin. Now, of course, the Gemara rejects that for any number of reasons. One is, what is the benefit? If you knocked out my eye, how do I gain anything by knocking out your eye? Wouldn't I rather get some kind of compensation? Or maybe the two eyes, no two people's eyes are exactly the same. So it's not, there's no real equality in a certain sense. That's the Gemara, that's the commentaries. But in the Shimshon story, you actually have ayin tachat ayin as the default punishment. And notice once again, it's all about Shimshon within the Philistine world. The tribe of Judah says, the leading tribe says, "What are you making trouble for us? We're not enemies. We get nothing to do with you. It's about Shimshon and his father-in-law and the wife. That's all. It's all personal. It's nothing to do with you whatsoever." Okay, that's that. And let me make one other comment, and I'll stop and take any comments and questions. And that is, when the parents of Shimshon, especially the mother is informed by the angel. Back in chapter 13, she's told that you're going to have a child, and he is going to be a Nazir, be a Nazarite, and you have to start acting yourself as a Nazarite. And the angel says to her something that the father is never told, not by the angel, not by her, namely, Hu yachel lo'oshia Yisrael biyad plishtim. Yachel lo'oshia Yisrael miyad plishtim. He will begin, Yachel, latchil. He will begin to bring redemption for Israel from the Philistines. Now, I wanted to mention one thing, which I'm not going to get into now, but just an example of why this approach, to me, is a very good approach to the study of Bible. And that is, he's going to begin to bring about redemption to the Philistines, suggests that he's going to begin, but someone else is going to continue it. He will begin from straight out and says one thing. He's not going to bring full redemption from the Philistines. He will defeat the Philistines, but he won't complete the job. Others will have to complete the job. Now, who in fact does complete the job in the Bible? Who is the person or persons who actually defeat the Philistines?
David.
Well, it's two people. It is David ultimately, but it's before him is Saul. King Saul also fights against the Philistines. He also defeats the Philistines. A long chapter. And in fact, in the biography of Saul, which appears at the end of chapter 14, Saul, wherever Saul went, he was successful, lists a bunch of nations, and then it mentions, and the Philistines. And the Philistines, the biography of Saul. And then if David comes, of course, in David's great moment, which sets him off on the path, is the defeat of the Philistine, Haplishti, who is Goliath. And of course, afterwards, there are other wars of David against the Philistines, etc., etc. And I'm not going to get into that now, but I want to make a simple point, which is actually not in the book. I didn't pick this up in the book, but the point is that what this verse invites us to do is something that until very recently I didn't even think of myself. To suddenly read the story of David in light of Samson. And when you begin to think about the story of David in light of Samson, it raises all kinds of very interesting possibilities. By the way, I haven't worked this out myself. I have many thoughts about it. That's the beauty of this approach, because you have the intertext. For example, Samson is unique. Samson fights, first of all, fights totally alone, but he has superhuman strength. One might say he's the ultimate Goliath. He's Goliath, times 10. Superhuman strength. Then you have, after Samson, the one who fights the Philistines is Saul. Now, Saul is not Goliath. Saul is certainly not Samson. But Saul is the biggest person. He's the biggest of all. And then when Saul loses God's favor and the spirit departs from Saul, and then suddenly you're faced with a bigger Saul. So that's the story. And Saul can't fight Goliath. And the point of the book of Shmuel is, if you rely on size and force alone, you cannot win. At least the Jewish people can't win. There's always somebody bigger. And when David fights Goliath, he doesn't fight as Saul. In fact, Saul offers him his armor, and David rejects it. The point being, if we fight on Goliath's terms, we will lose, because Goliath is bigger than us. And in fact, the Philistines, it's not just Goliath, but in the book of Shmuel, there's a list of Bnei Harapha, the daughters, the sons of the giant woman. The Rephaim are identified in the book of Shmuel with the Plishtim. And the point is that when you read the story of Saul and then David, and you take into account the story of Shimshon, and suddenly begin to get this picture, which, when you look at the three of them together, you see this sort of progression, and you come to recognize that for the book of Shmuel, that's the point. Force alone will never succeed. There's always someone bigger than us. The Jews are a small nation. We have valiant warriors, but you can't rely just on force. You're not going to solve your problems with force alone. That will never work. There's got to be another element over here, which at that point in time, Saul doesn't have. God has departed from Saul. It's only David, with a combination of his courage, actually. He takes the first step. But he has an understanding, if you act valiantly, God will be with you, which is certainly true in the book of Shmuel. When you're walking with God, God walks with you in the book of Shmuel. But I'm saying suddenly when you read that verse about Shimshon, he will begin to redeem Israel from the Philistines, and suddenly you have a question, he'll begin, but that already is telling us, the reader, that someone else is going to continue. And you begin to read the book of Shmuel as a continuation of the Shimshon story, and then suddenly you say something else to yourself. Isn't it interesting that the first chapter of the book of Shmuel plays off the story of Shimshon? The story of Hannah, as we studied, and the story of the birth of Shimshon are parallel stories. They're very different stories, but they are parallel stories. So the book already from the beginning, from the first chapter, invites the reader to think about Shimshon. And then later on, that Shimshon story is still in our heads. And we're reading the Saul story and the David story in light of Shimshon. Now, all what I said now is not in the book, but my point is that our learning together, which I always favor much more than books, because when you write a book, you say something, and that's what you wrote. But when you're in a class, when you're learning with other people, there's always ideas, there's always challenges, ideas, etc. Sometimes you completely disagree with the idea, but it gets you to think. In the book, my hope has always been that when I write something, that it will get people to think. And they'll come up with their own ideas, maybe better ideas. But the idea of learning Torah is we get together and put something out there, we think about it, and sometimes it creates a spark and we're able to move forward with it. So In any event, I was thinking about this verse. I should never thought of it before. So the story over here, again, one of the key features of our learning has been these intertexts. You have these sometimes, like in this case, obvious parallels, sometimes less obvious. Always begins with the language, but to underscore the point, and I'll stop here and take any comments or questions. Shimshon fights alone. He's not. There's no. On the contrary, he's never fighting as a Jew. On the contrary, the Jews actually tie him up over here in this chapter. They're going to hand him over to the Philistines. Shimshon just says to the Jews, please don't kill me yourself. That's all. You want to tie me up? That's okay. But don't kill me. Okay, let me stop here for a moment to say many things. Does anybody have any comments, questions, or anything else? Speak up.
Yes, just a comment from the chat from Stacy
Right.
Lehman. Quote, even Catholics understand that David's win is spiritual, which is why they move the sculpture of David to the entrance of the church rather than the entrance to the city. Stacy, you care to elaborate?
The Gospels certainly believe that David is related to. They trace the lineage of Jesus to David. I mean, obviously for them, David is the forerunner of the Mashiach. I mean, get the Catholics, forget the Christians. In our tradition, David is the forerunner, right? David Mashiach Tzidkecha. We pray we have prayers, right? The prayer for the Redeemer, right? God revealed to us, Bimkolcha Malkeinu Tofia, right? Right? And V'inenu Terena Malchutecha, we should see your kingship, right? For us, it's the first coming, right? As it is written, Ayidei David Mashiach Tzidkecha. We are citing the words of David, the poetry of David, and in effect, we're recalling David. We have David, the of David as the forerunner of the messianic line. So certainly, and by the way, even in our basic prayer of the Jewish people, which is the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, David is mentioned twice. He's mentioned in terms of rebuilding the people of Israel, and of course also about Jerusalem, which is Jerusalem's the temple. Yerushalayim is the temple. So David is both the builder of the temple, right? He builds the temple, or he finds the place of the temple. The son builds the building, but David is a builder of the temple. He also is the one that brings sovereignty to Israel. The city of Jerusalem is both the temple, it's also David's city. David is the king, and in theory, David has a kind of eternal line, because the kingship is dynastic. It passes down from generation to generation. So within our own tradition, we have David as both. We have David as messianic figure. We have David as builder of the temple. And those two things, I presume, are related to each other. The king, in theory, reflecting God's true man. God is the true monarch. God is the king. But the human king can reflect God's kingship, optimally reflects God's kingship. Of course, most of the time, the human king is not reflecting God's kingship, which, of course, is the main question raised by the book of Samuel. Because even though in theory that's the way it should be, but in practice, it usually doesn't work that way. But that's another conversation. What else? No, nothing. Anything else?
Nothing else in chat, but people are welcome to unmute and ask for themselves.
More than welcome. If not, we'll continue. We have 20 more minutes. I'm happy to continue. Part 2. All right. You can always email me with questions, by the way, dsilber@risha.org. Okay, so now let me make another point over here. There's a lot to say here. The Philistines go to the Jews. That's in chapter 15, beginning in verse number, what is it over there? I can't even see what verse it is. Verse number 9, right? And they said in verse number 10, right? And the people of Judah say to the Plishtim, why have you come up against us? No, it's not they're coming to fight them. We came to tie up Shimshon. To do to him what he did to us. Talked about that already. 3,000 Jews. Now, this is the Jews. The Jews are coming to hand Shimshon over to the Philistines. Vayamru Shimshon, Halo yadato ki moshlim banu plishtim. Don't you know that the Philistines rule over us? Mazot osito lanu. What have you done to us? They accuse him. What are you making trouble for? Don't you know that the Philistines are ruling? What are you starting up for? What are you starting up for? I talked about that already. I'm just doing to them what they did to me. It's nothing to do with you. It's personal. We came to tie you up. To hand you over to the Philistines. Swear to me, in God's name, that you will not harm me yourselves. I said, no, we're not going to harm you. We're not going to kill you. We're not going to kill you. We're just going to hand you over. They bound him up with 2 new ropes, and they brought him up from the rock. Two comments over here. One touches upon what we have already discussed a bit, which is one of the points that I made about Shimshon the Nazarite, is that in the Chumash, there's somebody else who is not technically a Nazarite, but he is, I would say, has the character of the Nazarite. And that is Joseph. Joseph, who is actually called the Nazarite, both by his father in the blessing of Yaakov in chapter 49, and by the tribe of Joseph, by Moshe and Bezot HaBracha, Nazir Echav. A Nazir is one who's separate. Joseph is separate from everybody. If you think about the Joseph story in the book of Breshit, it's very interesting. That the brothers think of killing their Joseph, and at the end of the day, they don't actually kill him. Reuven says, why should we kill him with our own hands? Throw him into a pit. Let him die in the pit. And Reuven says, okay, well, when they're not looking, I'm going to pull him out of the pit. But he says to the brothers, he doesn't say to the brothers, I'm going to pull him out of the pit. He says to the brothers, let's throw him into a pit. He'll die in the pit. It's the desert. He can't get out of the pit. So he'll die there, but we will not have killed him. We will cause his death, but not kill him. And they throw him into the pit. The word for the pit is a bar. A bar. That's when he's in with the brothers, right? The brothers who had gone to Shechem and went to Dotan. That's chapter 37. And then you get to chapter 39, Joseph in Egypt. And Joseph is in the house of Potiphar. And step by step, he is incredibly successful. And Potiphar appoints him to one position after the next. And in short order, he runs the whole show. And then you have the episode of Mrs. Potiphar. She sees that Joseph is, in her mind, supplanted the husband. Suddenly he looks so beautiful, he's so handsome. So she propositions Joseph, and Joseph refuses her. Then who does he refuse? He runs away from her, and she's holding on to his coat. And she then accuses Joseph of trying to attack her, etc. And what does Potiphar hears the story, gets very angry. What does he do? He throws Joseph into jail. Chapter 39, Joseph is in jail. What does the Torah say about the jail? So the Torah has several different words for jail. Within the Joseph story itself, the jail is described in different ways. One way is Beit HaSohar. Remember this? It's Beit HaSohar. Sohar is probably actually not, it's not a Hebrew word, certainly. It's probably an Egyptian word. Sohar in Hebrew is what? What's Sohar in Hebrew? Sohar is actually the means
A
gravity.
window.
That's Sohar. Sohar is a window. Sohar actually means the moon. Shraga, right? Sohar is actually the moon. Doesn't matter. It means a prison. That's the Beit HaSohar. In the Beit HaSohar, says the Chumash, Makom Asher Asirei HaMelech Asurim, where those literally tied up by the kings are tied up. Nowadays we call it Beit HaAsurim. It's another term for it. Beta asurim, to be tied up. Asur is the word we have over and over again in the Shimshon story. Shimshon is tied up by the Jews in chapter 15, and he's tied up by Jezebel in chapter 16, right? She ties him up, right? Some Leonard Cohen song, right? And Hallelujah, right? You tied me up. You put me in a chair. You tied me up. He's Asur. The people then in chapter 39 of Genesis, 2 of the king's officers are sent to the jail. What does it call the jail in terms of the king's officers? Chapter 39, Mishmar. It's called the Mishmar. Why is it called the Mishmar? Mishmar means a place where they're watched. Why is it called the Mishmar? A Mishmar, why? A Mishmar means a place that you're watched temporarily. In other words, a kind of a holding pen.
A holding,
Because
right.
the 2 officers are going to be summoned a few days later and brought before the king as a trial, whatever. The king will pardon one and execute the other. That's a Mishmar. So we have Soar, we have Asur, we have Mishmar, and then we have a 4th term. Joseph is in jail, and Joseph told the butler, 3 days from now is Pharaoh's birthday, and you're going to get out, and you're going to go be invited to Pharaoh's party, and Pharaoh's going to give back the coast to you, the cup, and you're going to serve Pharaoh once again. And do me a favor, says Joseph, when you are free, and I gave you the good news, when you are free, remember me to Pharaoh, right? And get me out of this house, because I was stolen from the hand of the Hebrews. V'gampolo asiti mu'umah ki samu oti babor. Here also I did nothing, that they placed me in the pit. And when Pharaoh summons Joseph, vayiritzu min habor, and they hastened him out of the pit. So Joseph is somebody that the brothers threw in a bar in chapter 37, and the Egyptians throw him in a bar in chapter 39. He's the ultimate Nazir. The brothers can't stand the guy, and the Egyptians can't eat with Joseph. He has no place. He's neither here nor there, which is the Joseph story. But the story of Joseph is that the way it's going to be? Or can Joseph reunite with his family? And the answer is Joseph will reunite with his family. It's what Yaakov accomplishes. Is it a full unification? Do they really trust him 100%? Chumash leaves us in Breshit with a big, gigantic question mark. But he certainly sees himself as part of the brothers. Bring my body back. In any event, my point is, here you have this in the Shimshon story. The idea of the Nazir. The Jews tie him up in chapter 15, and in chapter 16, his wife Delilah ties him up as well. She ties him up several times. Because in chapter 16, he says to Delilah, after he falls in love, we only have 10 minutes here, but let me just say a couple of more things about this. In chapter 16, verse number 4, he falls in love with a woman in the Wadi of Sorek. Her name was Delilah. Now, the name Delilah, it probably is a play on 2 different things at the very same time. Words can have multiple meanings. Names often have multiple meanings in the Bible. And I think here it's clearly they have two meanings. One is within the word Delilah, we have the word Lamed Yud Lamed Hey, which is Lila, which is night. She's married to I would say she's married to Shemesh. She's married to Shimshon. She's married to the sun. She's married to the light. And her name is darkness. So he loves a woman, he loves darkness. And if your name is Shimshon, you shouldn't fall in love with the darkness. That's number one. But number 2, there's another play on the name Delilah, which is the word Dow. What is a Dow in the Chumash, right? What is the Dow? Dow means one, right? To be Dow means what?
A poor person,
Poor person, or even more than that,
needy.
a weak person, right? The Dow has a meaning of weakness. So he's marrying this person of enormous strength, marries somebody who, in fact, is going to weaken him. She's going to find the way to weaken him. She doesn't know how to weaken him, but she will find a way, and she does it because in the very beginning of the story, right in this verse, the Philistines go to her, and we have the parallel to the first Shimshon stories. As I mentioned last week, chapter 13, 14, and 15 are one story, and chapter 16 is a second parallel story. Each one ends the same way. The first story ends with Samson's prayer to God and his victory and prayer. And the second story will end with his prayer to God. The first story had a woman who reveals his secret. The second story is about the woman who will reveal his secret. She's much more dangerous. The difference between them is that with the first one, he is simply using her for his own purposes. But the second story, what does him in is he falls in love. This is the tragedy of Shimshon, actually. He's not allowed to fall in love. He's not allowed to fall in love because when you're in love with somebody, you tell them at least some of your secrets, if not all. And he can't do that. There's a secret he cannot tell, because if he tells the secret, he breaks the bond with God. There's an intimacy he has with God. They share they share a truth that no one else can know. And now he falls in love. Didn't fall in love with the first woman. He didn't fall in love with the prostitute who appears in the beginning of chapter 16, but he falls in love with Delilah. And interesting is that the writer of this book, right, in that very first verse, there's something in that verse that tips us off right away that we're going to be in deep trouble over here. Shimshon will be in deep, deep trouble when he marries this woman. As I said, he's not allowed to fall in love. That love is very dangerous because it threatens to the Shimshon. Certainly, there's a piece of secret knowledge that only he and God may share. But my point is, there's something in the verse that's interesting.
David?
It is, yes?
Could it be that it says Ushma, Delilah? Interesting, Ushmo Haman. And sometimes when the description of the Tanakh precedes the name with it's a little trill, Ushmo, Ushma. Maybe that's an introduction, a tiny tip-off that what's coming is not totally kosher.
And we have Mordechai also, Shmuel,
Yeah.
Mordechai, ben Yehuda.
Well, he's about to do, he's whether or not he's behaving properly when he sort of sets up the whole, when he, goes to.
Maybe. I had a different
I think that's what the Gemara is picking up on when it says he really provoked the whole Haman episode. I mean, I think the Ushmo this and Ushmo that, and here it's Ushma Delilah. I think things are not always what they seem, and the text is giving you just the tiniest little trumpet trill.
Could be so. I have another thought in mind, though, which is not about Shema Delilah at all. Something else. She comes from Nachal Sorek. Now, what does the word Sorek mean? We have it in the Chumash, actually. And actually, we have it. It's very striking in the blessing giving to Yehuda. Yaakov's blessing to Yehuda talks about Yehuda's leadership, his strength. Osvi la gefen iro, v'lasoreka b'ni atono. Right? Let me see how they translate in the JPS. It's chapter 49. Jacob's blessing to Judah. Yeah, it's chapter 49, verse number 11. I'll read it to you. Osvi la gefen iro, v'lasoreka b'ni atono. He based by Yayin Uvusho v'daman avim suto. Here's the translation. He tethers his ass to a vine. His ass's foal to a choice vine. Soreka is a choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, his robe in the blood of grapes. He marries a woman from Nachal Sorek. And the point is, of course, he's a Nazarite. And the one thing a Nazarite cannot do is drink wine. And not just that, by the way. But as I mentioned to you, and it could even be the pshat, I didn't make this up. When Shimshon is traveling with his parents to Timnah to meet the woman that Shimshon wants to marry, the one who suits his purposes, and they come to a vineyard. They come to a vineyard, and it says, and Samson was walking, and a lion came towards him, and Samson kills the lion. And then he goes back next time, and he finds the honey, the hive inside the lion, and he doesn't tell his parents. And the commentaries say, why didn't the parents know? Weren't the parents walking with him? So the commentaries said, no. They came to a vineyard. And when they came to a vineyard, he couldn't walk with them because he's a Nazarite. He doesn't get into the vineyard. There's an expression in the Talmud. We say to the Nazarite, go around the vineyard. Schar, walk, don't go to the vineyard. It's not about the Nazarite. It's about all of us. Don't put yourself in a situation where you might be in trouble. As we say in the morning prayers, it's in our prayers. It's actually in the Gospels too. Lead us not unto temptation. So he went to the vineyard. We say to the Nazarite, don't get to the vineyard. Walk around the vineyard. That's the beginning of the Samson story, chapter 14. And now in chapter 16, it's the problem. He falls in love with a woman from Nachal Sorek. And right away, you know, the last thing this guy needs is the Sorek. It's the choice vine. She's the choice vine, but he's a human being who falls in love. That's really the tragedy of the Samson story is that he's been given a role where he can't be fully human. Human beings are given the propensity to love. It's all kinds of different loves. But there's the love of the other. There's the love of God. There's the love of the stranger. And there's the love between people. And it could be friends, it could be teacher and student, could be a chavruta, could be husband, could be man and woman, husband and wife, etc. And that's to be human. Shimshon can't do that, actually. He can't fall in love with anybody. The Jews want to tie him up, and the Philistines want to tie him up. And his allegiance is to God alone. He only answers to God. And that's problematic. And you can see in the story the tragedy, the dilemma of Shimshon. He falls in love. It's not just another person he can use. You fall in love, and of course she's using him. And unlike the first woman, there's a difference between the first woman and Delilah, which is the first woman is pressured by these people at the wedding party to get the truth out of Shimshon. They threaten her. What you brought us, and eventually they kill her. She's eventually killed by the Philistines. With Delilah, it's not about that. With Delilah, the Philistines approach her and they bribe her. They come with money. They come with, if you can get the truth out of this guy, we will give you 1,100 coins, right? So she's in it just for the money. He may love her. For her, it's a business transaction, and she's going to try to get the truth out of him. Let me just say one last thing about the story, and we'll have to stop, unfortunately. But the chapter 16, you have the first part of the chapter is her attempt to get the truth out of Shimshon. And she tries to do it 4 different times. She tells him straight up. She says, "Listen, let me ask you a question." She says to Shimshon, "Your great strength. How can?" Let's find this verse because she does it for the money. They have the promise of the money, and in verse number 6, "Vayitomer Delilah Shimshon Hagidon Ali b'ameh kochacha gadol uv'ameh te'oser la'anotecha." Tell me, what is the source of your great strength, and how could you be tied up and made helpless? She actually says explicitly to him, let me ask you a question. How can you be reduced to just a normal human being so that others could actually tie you up and made helpless? It's worse than that. La'anotecha, to oppress you. How could you be oppressed? Tell me how you could be oppressed. And Shimshon answers her, but he doesn't tell her the truth. I'll just make one last comment about this. There's so much more here, but he gives us 4 answers. The first 3 answers are not true. The first 2 have to do with tying up, with cords that bind him. And each time she says, she falls asleep and she says, Shimshon, the Philistines are upon you. And he breaks out of the bonds the first 2 times. The third time she says, why do you keep lying to me? You say you love me, but you just make fun of me. Tell me the truth. And the third time he says, you've been deceiving me all along. She says to him, which verse is this? Verse number 13. Verse number 13. Shimshon, right? You lied to me all this. He says to her, if you weave 7 locks of my head into the web. In other words, what you have over here is the first 2 about tying him up. The third one, he mentions his hair. He doesn't tell her the truth. That's the 4th time after she's nagging him to death. He wishes to die. She can't take it anymore. And he tells her the truth. But you see over here something interesting, that he's getting closer to the truth. In other words, he doesn't want to tell her. Obviously, he knows he can't reveal the secret. But at the end of the day, she keeps nagging. He gets closer and closer, and finally, at the end, he says the truth. I was chosen by God from birth to do God's work. I'm a Nazir. I'm a Nazarite. If you cut my hair, I'll lose my strength. I'll just conclude with the following point, which I think is an interesting point about the story. Why does Samson lose his strength? The answer is to cut his hair. I don't think that's actually the pshat in the story. It is true that by cutting his hair, he loses his strength. But the truth of the matter is, the cutting the hair is an objective reflection. It's a reflection of the true reason he loses his strength. He loses his strength because he reveals the secret. If you think about the Samson story from beginning to end, it's all about secret knowledge. That's the Samson's riddles. There's something about something that only I can know. I can't reveal the truth about myself. And that is, from a human standpoint, I think, the tragedy of Shimshon. To be able to reveal the truth, to be able to speak freely and to reveal the truth, I'll say one thing about Drisha. We appointed a CEO at Drisha, Chana Luxon, who's great, and she's going to be running Drisha. And I want to tell you why I actually started Drisha. You started Drisha to give women opportunities to learn Torah. That wasn't the reason I started it. It's true that Drisha has done way more than anybody else as far as advancing learning for women. That is certainly the case. It wasn't why I started it. I wanted a place, very selfish, where I could speak my truth. I'm not saying I'm right, but I wanted a place where you can talk, say what you actually believe. Don't have to pretend to be somebody else. For myself and everybody else who joins. How can you say that? Well, you can say whatever you want. We can still discuss it. We can respectfully critique it. But that's the idea of learning Torah. And that's what I think a place should be. And I always felt that a place I can't speak my mind, it's not a place I want to be. Because if you can't speak your mind, you can't be a full person, actually. And therein lies the tragedy of Shimshon. He can't actually tell anybody else his truth. He has a truth, which he can't reveal. And that is what makes the Shimshon story very tragic. I think from a certain perspective, it's the most superhuman person is, in a certain way, the most human, actually. A very human story about this superhuman person. Okay, thank you all for joining. I want to bless all of us who should be able to put ourselves in places where we can speak the truth and maybe find some truths as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure learning with you all. If you want to keep learning with Rabbi Silber, he will be teaching more this summer, including on Tisha B'Av, where Rabbi Silber and other Drisha staff will be doing explanatory keynote starting at 10 a.m. with other afternoon classes. You can sign up at drisha.org/classes. And with that, Take care.